You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnstone, and with me this week we have Connor.
Hello.
And we have Mansoor.
Hello.
And this is a sequel. It's great, we're doing a sequel. So a little while back we talked about Hornet's Nest, which was Tom Baker's big exciting return to the role of the Doctor for the first time in a bit. We couldn't quite work out when it was. There was the Doctor Who 1999, there was Dimensions in Time, etc. The Shard video. But no, we've decided that it was Tom Baker's return to the role after quite a while. And obviously Hornet's Nest had a sequel series, Demon Quest. Had another sequel series, Serpent's Crest, but we'll do that another day. Right now we're on Demon Quest. So we are back to talk about that. So it's 5 stories. We're going to go through it episode by episode, and we're going to sort of talk about what we think of it. So we'll dive straight in. So the first episode is The Relics of Time. And I quite like this one because it's kind of Mrs. Wibbsy's first episode as a companion. She was there in the first series. She was certainly a sort of main supporting character, as it were. But this one's the one where she really sort of starts to feel like a companion, and she travels in the TARDIS, and she kind of starts off the whole series of events that lead to the rest of the series and all that kind of thing. So it's a really, really good Wibbsy episode. So, Connor, we'll go with you first. What did you think of The Relics of Time?
Well, I thought straight away off the bat, as you said, this is Mrs. Wibbsy's first episode as a companion, and she's wonderful in that role. Similar sort of vein to Evelyn Smythe and having an older woman, as the Doctor's companion. It just works really, really well. It's something different than typical, young 20-something companions, which certainly feels pretty constant throughout the classic era. And Susan Jameson's just absolutely wonderful. I'll always love seeing her turn up in things or hear her turn up in things. One of my favourite TV shows ever is New Tricks, which she was a regular in. So always I'm delighted to hear her in something. She turns up a couple of times in Big Finish things, and it's wonderful to hear her actually get to be a Doctor Who companion in this. Wibbsy's a great character. She's really, really... I was going to say likable. I like her. I do like her a lot, but she's maybe not traditionally, likable in the traditional sense. It's a wonderful role, and I think she's, as I say, she's a great character. Little bit of a sort of box of delights feel to this story as well, with the sort of going back to ancient Britain thing, and that's I'm maybe not quite making the connection between those as intended, but that's I sort of associate that with let's go back in time and visit ancient Britain thing with the box of delights. So it's a nice little vibe to tap into. There's also something of a twist in this where they discover that the Emperor Claudius, or somebody masquerading as him or himself, is actually in possession of something very like a TARDIS. I love those reveals in Doctor Who where the Doctor and his companions stumble on another TARDIS and things suddenly seem to kick up a notch. The stakes raise up. in that sort of sense. So I really like that reveal, and I really like that twist. It's a great opener for the series. It does feel a little more grounded and maybe a little less off the wall. I think the series as a whole feels like that compared to Hornet's Nest. But I still love that this run of stories carves out, is carving out its own little era, and it's not, paying too much homage or too much sort of lip service, I suppose, to other eras of Doctor Who. It's just definitively its own little thing and is much stronger for it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that this has a very different feel to Hornet's Nest, and again, Serpent's Crest is its own very different thing, and each series kind of plays with format a bit, and each series does something different, has something different to offer. It's got its own identity, and this one kind of immediately sort of sets out what it's going to be in this episode, I think, and it's nice to sort of immediately recognise that there has been a little bit of a shift in tone and a shift in the Doctor and Mrs. Wibsey's relationship and all that kind of thing. Mansoor, what are your thoughts on this first one?
Yeah, I echo what you both said, and just lots of nice little touches. Mrs. Wibsey we've mentioned already, but it's not just her; it's the dynamic she has with Tom Baker's Doctor as well. It's just really, natural. They just fall into that Doctor companion relationship very, very easily. Um, and and I like those little sort of storytelling fairy tale type touches, like the sort of opening narration from the Doctor. It's not word for word, but it's almost like the kind of like grand language from the song "I Am the Doctor." And he's talking about him coming back to Nest Cottage and from voyaging time and space, and yeah. Oh, and what I noticed as well. There's a really nice little moment in this first episode that comes back, or in a subtle way later on, and it's the bit where Mrs. Wibsey's talking about being homesick for her own era, and you look at that in isolation, and it's just a sort of example of the Doctor being a bit blunt and not quite getting human emotions, and sort of saying, "No, no, you have to stay here. There's nothing for you back where you came from." Um, but then that gets picked up in the final episode and comes back around in a nice way. So really, really strong opening.
Yeah, it's got that great feel of. It sort of does remind me of a little bit of sort of like a Russell T Davies series opener. Your Smith and Jones or Partners in Crime, that kind of thing. It's a bit
Doesn't
like,
waste any time.
yeah, don't waste any time. Get us going straight away. It's a little bit light all around, a bit light-hearted and not too heavy. It sets up for the rest of the series. We've got our sort of hook that's going to keep us throughout there. And it's all happening in present tense this time. We're following the action as it happens, whereas a lot of Hornet's Nest, we were kind of being told about what had happened up to that point by the Doctor. And it was only really the last episode that arrived in the now, whereas this is all happening as it happens, I guess is the best way to put it. But yeah, it's a nice strong start. It sort of plays around with Romany stuff. I really like the idea of sort of the goddess Wibsentia, and it's pretty obvious where that's going straight away. It's quite funny. Yeah, it's a great fun little opening episode. So we'll move on to the Demon of Paris. I love it's a funny thing to pick on, I suppose, but I love the cover to this one, which is obviously the sort of famous Lautrec illustration, but the Doctor is in it and it's actually referenced in the story. And I think all the covers of this series kind of play on something. I think I've got that right. But yeah, it's sort of a nice little nod to a famous piece of artwork, this one. So Connor, go ahead and talk about the Demon of Paris.
I really enjoy it, and I like that. I get the impression that that sort of era for Paris is maybe something of a pet era for Paul Mars, because it turns up again in big finish with the Muse of Fire. I think it's a great idea to go back and sort of do a Doctor Who story based around the inspiration for the Fourth Doctor's costume. With, as you say, that famous piece of artwork on the cover. So that's a great idea for a Doctor Who story. It's very cool to hear Mrs. Wibsey sort of connecting slightly more with Paris, and her being able, I think she had wanted to visit Paris, or she was excited to visit Paris. It was her sort of broadening horizons a bit in a way that she's more comfortable with and sort of can understand a bit more, rather than the TARDIS hurtling her off to, miniaturizing her down and crawling around inside a zebra's brain, or shooting off to ancient Britain, that sort of thing. So that's a big plus. There's some bizarre imagery in there as well with the cult of Fourth Doctors that turns up. I quite like that a lot. Yeah, I like it, and again, it's, as I said earlier, it feels a bit more grounded and maybe not just as off the wall as a lot of the Hornet's Nest stuff was, but still retains a good bit of whimsy and slightly offbeat elements that I would associate with Paul Meyer's writing.
I'm working very, very hard to not say Marsian, which I think I used about 15 times in the Hornet's Nest episode. But yeah, it does kind of encapsulate all of that. Mansoor, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I like this one, and th- it does. Yeah, I definitely see that thing about it being a bit more grounded, even just in terms of like the threat and the like. You get these like rotting corpses that are kind of like a sort of quite creepy, but also quite real, unsettling bit of imagery cropping up in this one, and I think a few of the other episodes you get like that strand running through them. Um, yeah, and I liked the accents, so I think were just the right, like walk the line of kind of doing French, because I sometimes feel like when you do something set in another country but people are speaking English, like sometimes it's best to just go with just English accents and let people use their native accents because they're not speaking the actual language anyway. Um, but I think they do sort of just the right amount that suits the tone of this story. And uh, yeah, and I liked the. I think the mystery builds quite well over these 5 episodes. And talking about how it does have a different feel and identity from Hornet's Nest, like spoiler for the last episode of this run of 5, but I did not see the return of the Hornets coming because this does feel like a different thing, and it's not. I mean, when you go back and look, there are clues, but it's not. I thought it wasn't like really obviously telegraphed that this is just going to be a returning villain coming back. Um, so yeah, enjoyed this one, and I think this sets up Mike coming back in for the 3rd episode, doesn't it? They have like the answer phone message from him at the end, which was a nice little touch because I was wondering where he was or whether he was going to be a major part of this series. So yeah, I was happy to see him come back in the next one as well.
He's kind of hinted to be returning throughout these first 2, but I actually quite like the fact that we get some just Doctor and Mrs. Wibsey time
Yeah,
without Mike in this. He's still there, he's still present. Is he via a voicemail or something?
in this one, yeah, I think it
Something
sort of
like that.
swaps the dynamic. Like it
Yeah.
sort of reverses the dynamic from the last one because in that one, Mike was primarily the companion, and yeah, Mrs. Wibsey was kind of in the background. But then in these first 2 episodes, it's the other way around. Mike's not there or on a voicemail message, and Mrs. Wibsey is front and center.
Yeah, and it gives us a bit of time to get to know her a bit better, and I think she has mellowed a bit since the first series as well. She's a bit less
Oh
grumpy with
yeah,
the Doctor, a bit less brash, and
I think she's retained like just enough of her like edge and like slight bit of grumpiness and aloofness, but there's like you can tell that she's mellowed a little bit.
Suppose it's kind of comparable to how Donna shifted slightly between Runaway Bride and
Yeah,
Partners in
yeah,
Crime. It's just that just sort of subtle retooling of a character, I guess, to just kind of make them fit into that companion role. And I mean, Mrs. Wibsey's still so far from being a traditional sort of companion. I suppose Donna is as well when you think about it, but it really does just sort of give us chance to get to know this kind of new Mrs. Wibsey, the one that is now the Doctor's companion and travels in TARDIS. And I kind of like that the start of the series has kind of come from her being sort of a bit kind of comedically ditzy,
yeah.
and it's kind
To,
of
to co-
led into all of this.
yeah, and to compare another TV era, I would have really liked to have seen that with Yaz and the 13th Doctor, to have them have a bit of time on their own before someone else comes back in, because the dynamic changes when you have like one companion on their own with the Doctor, and it's nice to explore that sometimes.
Well, that's what Big Finish is for. We hope. um, but yeah, it's so far we've had two sort of really great, strong episodes that have sort of focused on Mrs. Wibsey a lot more. And am I right in thinking that the Demon of Paris is actually told from Mrs. Wibsey's perspective? She's the narrator, isn't she? Have I got that
I think
right?
so, yeah.
Because
Yeah, because that, yeah.
each episode here has a different narrator, or the narrators change up a fair bit. And I'm sure this is Wibsey's. I'm trying to remember now. Anyway, we'll move on, and we'll move on to A Shard of Ice, which is, now that we've had two stories of Mrs. Wibsey as the companion, she kind of disappears from this one a little bit, and this is the Mike Yates story, which I really like. We get a proper Mike Yates travelling in the TARDIS as a companion story, which I know Big Finish have done it a couple of times since, but it was a fairly new thing when this first came out. So, Connor, over to you again. Shard of Ice.
I really like this one. It feels like it's playing in a sort of Grimm's Tales sort of sandbox, which is a wonderful atmosphere and a wonderful aesthetic, I suppose, to go for. You do get that. I really love wintry settings, and really, really like, if you do, Doctor Who in a blizzard is it just appeals to me for reasons I can't quite describe. But I love that sort of setting. And gravitate towards it quite a lot, so it's very, very welcome here. Um, I like the Doctor and Mike as a bit of a change in dynamic. The only story I think that we had that was the Doctor and Mike the whole way through the adventure in Hornet's Nest was the last episode. So this feels a little bit. It feels like it's not just breaking the mold of this series, but also from the first series as well. Which I enjoy, and I think it works very effectively here. Albert's a great sort of guest character where he's a slightly pathetic character, in that he's plagiarized all of the stories that he's claimed to be his own. And the doc, or he wants the Doctor has a copy of his books, and he wants to take the short way route and just copy them out of that, and sort of short circuit time in a way, I guess, by stealing his own ideas from his own book from the future. And the Doctor absolutely refuses to give it to him. That's a really great little exchange. So yeah, I really, really like this one.
What about you, Mansoor?
I like this one as well. And I've just noticed a little bit of trivia. I was just like the other day, sort of musing that it would be cool if Big Finish got June Hudson in to do some alternative covers for some of their Tom Baker stories. And I've just seen that she did the cover for this story. So there's like a version of it on the front cover, and then there's like a larger version of it inside the liner notes. So yeah, that's a fun little detail. Um, yeah, again, I think, like I was saying before, I think the mystery sort of builds quite rapidly. It sort of moves at pace, and you kind of get this next reveal and the next step uh, of uh, sort of understanding who this person is that Albert's been in contact with. Um, yeah, don't have much more to say on it. I was wondering whether Albert was based on a particular real author or not. I don't know if either of you had any thoughts, but I couldn't spot any specific links to, uh, or any obvious links to any real authors. So maybe he's just a completely original creation, not referring to anyone.
I have to admit, I've never been able to pick sort of anyone in particular out. Well, I think sort of Connor was on the right lines with sort of Grimm's fairy tales type stories, that kind of thing. It's a bit sort of folk tale-y in a way, isn't it? So I imagine that perhaps it's sort of a personification of that kind of idea.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, I'm with you. I've never been able to sort of look at it and go, "Oh yeah, it's based on that person or whatever."
yeah,
Um, but I do like the way it's done. I like the fact that we have Albert as a sort of guest narrator, as it were,
yeah.
for chunks of this.
And Mike works really well in this one. And I'm trying to think back, and I think what was that the original concept for Nest Cottage having the Brigadier instead of Mike? Is that have I made that up, or
I
is
don't
that a
know
thing?
whether that's confirmed, but it's definitely something that's been theorized.
Right. What if there's any truth to that? I think going with Mike was. I can't imagine the Brigadier working in quite the same way that Mike does in these stories. Obviously, they would have been written around him if he'd been in them. But yeah, Mike just seems to fit the dynamic with the Doctor and Mrs. Wibsey really perfectly.
I do quite like the fact that these Nest Cottage stories, along with other stuff in Big Finish, has given Mike a kind of a new lease of life many years later. We have him kind of semi-returning to unit and being forgiven and all that kind of thing in Big Finish, and we have him working with the Doctor in this. I do quite like it. I do quite like the fact that he got to have his we got to kind of make up for the past, make up the events of Invasion of the Dinosaurs, and I know that was done with Planet of the Spiders, and it was never the character removed forever at the end of Dinosaurs, but it's definitely given him a much deserved second lease of life here, which I think
Yeah,
is great. Shall we head towards our next episode then, which is Starfall, and it all gets a bit comic booky, superhero-y, which is sort of a nice take on a kind of another kind of genre, and it sort of continues the story quite well. I quite like this one. I think this is a lot of fun. I think that it sort of really does push things forwards, and it just again it kind of it picks on a style. We've had Grimm's fairy tales, we've had the sort of the more grounded stuff in Paris before, and now we have a pretty solid superhero tale, and Doctor Who does superheroes hasn't actually happened that much. Like off the top of my head, I can think of this and Return of Doctor Mysterio. Um, and I think both are examples of doing it very well, but I think that they're doing it in different ways. This is very much sort of more comic book based, whereas Mysterio is much more big MCU films type based. So it's quite a unique Doctor Who story. This one is. So, Connor, what are your thoughts on it?
I think these days when you mention superhero pastiche, I think if you mention superheroes full stop, a lot of people's minds, mine included, go straight to the Marvel films. Um, but I got more of a vibe from this one. I feel it if Shard of Ice was playing in a Grimm's Tales sandbox, this is playing it in a Christopher Reeve Superman sandbox. That's the sort of production style and the production values I sort of imagined whenever I was listening to this. And it works really, really well. I really, really enjoyed that. Um, the guest characters are all great. Um, I really like the sort of slightly capricious former actress who's ultimately ends up being the villain of the piece. I think that's a great. I think it's a great twist, and that was a great character and a great performance. That was very, very fun to listen to. Um, and I enjoy the visual of the Doctor and Mrs. Wibsey, sauntering through New York and through Central Park in a sort of, I don't know whether it was intentional or whether it was meant to be like that, but it reminded me a little bit of City of Death. Um, that's very fresh in my head. I did watch it recently, so again, that's perhaps me seeing patterns and things that aren't there, but it does feel like a sort of New York American answer to City of Death, which is just a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's definitely a like you say, it's not going for the big over the top MCU kind of thing. It's still a very human story. I think it's still very sort of character focused. Like you say, some of the characters are great and they are, they're believable and they're real. And there's some. I'm using the word Marsian again, but there is some Marsian stuff going on, particularly with the sort of aging actress character. But yeah, it's that there's an awful lot to enjoy in here. Mansoor, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought the actress, the villain, the antagonist was lots of fun. Just like a really sort of like arch camp performance, and uh, yeah, it's interesting. Connor, you mentioned like Superman because I think there was a lot of that in Mysterio as well, and this predated Mysterio by quite a bit, didn't it? This was like a few years before. This was around what
Yeah, good.
2010.
Probably 5 years or so.
Yeah, and like for me, there's like a lot that connects the two stories. Not just that they're like set in America and about ordinary people getting superpowers, but I think Mysterio as well has a bit of a heart or like homage to like the Donna Superman films. Um, Even if some of like the trappings are different and a bit more sort of visual and kind of referencing the MCU a bit more. Um, but yeah, I think they're uh, both good stories. I think like the villain in this story like edges it out for me and kind of makes it a bit more of a sort of fun episode. Um, and yeah, I'm trying to think as well. So this is the penultimate one, isn't it? That leads into the final episode. So again, like I mentioned, like the structure of how the five of these work together. I think it just builds really well. You get like you get plot threads and elements coming back in quite a sort of deft way, and nothing feels laboured, and it's just like it's not wasting time building to the climax.
I do quite like the fact that there's a very, very sort of simple format at the heart of this series. It's very much pursue the bad guy and find the things. It's almost like an anti-key to time. Instead of finding all of these objects that put this thing together, they're literally just looking for things of the Doctor's and following clues. And this demon character keeps popping up every now and again. It's a really, really simple concept, but the stories it leads off to are what makes it so special and so enjoyable. And yeah, I really do like this sort of take on the superhero genre. And as we say, it does predate Mysterio by quite a few years, actually. And
Yeah,
when this was done, superhero characters weren't at the sort of forefront of everyone's mind as much as they are now. The MCU hadn't quite exploded into what it was going to be, and we weren't getting 3, 4, 5 films a year plus series plus everything else. And yeah, it just kind of it provides a kind of nice. I guess it's a more retro take on the idea, on the concept, and it works. It works quite nicely.
yeah.
Let's move into our finale. And the final episode, Sepulchre, is what obviously brings it all together, and we do get that big sort of fantastic reveal that the Hornets are back, they're behind it. And I quite like the idea that after such a different series, after this sort of going in a direction, all kinds of directions that you'd never have guessed from the first series, it does sort of come back to these characters, these villains that have kind of become a little bit of a nemesis for the Doctor in the Nest Cottage Chronicles. And I like the fact that it does loop back round and it does link back to Hornet's Nest. And, we get a lot of really, really, really powerful character stuff with Mrs. Wibsey, which, now because we've spent more time with her and because we now see her as a companion and because Susan Jameson's performance is just so bloody wonderful, it really hits hard. Like it's a really, really powerful finale. I do think that even though this finale it doesn't differ massively from the finale of Hornet's Nest, I just think the stakes are massively raised purely because we've spent more time with these characters. And of course we know the Doctor, and of course we know Mike, but it really is Mrs. Wibsey that kind of makes this finale for me, and I love the direction that it goes in and kind of where it leaves her and how at the end of it all, her and the Doctor have definitely sort of advanced the friendship somewhat. So Connor, talk to us about Sepulchre.
I must admit that the Return of the Hornets did throw me quite a bit, and I might need to give this one a bit, might need to re-listen to this one to maybe get the full benefit of it, because I was that surprised and that it did feel like it came out of the blue nearly. That the Hornets were returned. I didn't actually realise how nostalgic I felt. Now, I only listened to Hornets Nest for the first time around about a year ago. And it actually felt really good to hear them again and hear their whole sound treatment and Mrs. Wibsey's voice going all Hornety. I do definitely see, where you're coming from when you say that this feels similar to the first series finale. But it's a really good finale, and as you say, the stakes are much higher because we spent more time. It does feel almost like a betrayal when we hear Mrs. Wibsey back under the Hornets' control, which is just testament to how well she has been playing and performed, and how we have been able to connect with her over the course of this series. So that's a big plus in that regard. So yes, I enjoyed it. As I say, because it was that thrown by the Hornets' return, I do think I'll have to listen back through this one again. When we talked about Hornet's Nest, I'd heard that series through twice. I've only heard this one once, and I often find I click with things a lot more on a second listen. The Hornet reveal, I think I will appreciate a lot more. And the episode as a whole, once I've heard it again, going in expecting that. But yeah, it's a fantastic story, and it ties up the series very, very well.
I like how there are other just little callbacks to Hornet's Nest in this. Like, there's the Doctor has a message from Ernestina Scott, who was, a main character in, I think it was the second episode of the first series. And it just these little callbacks, these little things that kind of pull you as a listener slowly back into that first series, into that world of Hornet's Nest. And it just kind of, I think it subtly, very subtly prepares you for the Hornets coming back. I think it just kind of, it doesn't so much drop hints as just sort of tonally takes you to the right place and prepares you for it. And I think it's a great little twist. I really do think that after the whole series has been something so completely different, and it kind of does drag us back to this. So Mansoor, what are your thoughts on Sepulchre?
I mean, well, the thing is that like it is a surprise and it is a twist, and that in itself is welcome. Like it's a big difference between this and then like having a story that's called Return of the Daleks, and then at the end of episode one, it's sort of played as a massive surprise that the Daleks are in it. And whereas with this one, like, yeah, you don't see it, and it sort of
The
takes you by
the the
surprise.
Daleks are in Return of the Daleks. Blimey.
so so like so there's that, and also I think I did re-listen to it a second time this week, and I think there are nice little touches that you see looking back, and one of them is, and I don't know if I'm reading into this, but that moment I mentioned in the first episode of these five, when Mrs. Wibbsy's talking about being homesick, and I think retrospectively you can see that as a nice little hint or touch that, like, something's not quite right. Maybe she is just literally just homesick for the time that she grew up in. Um, but it also for me feels like something's not quite right with her, or something's not sitting well with her, and then retrospectively you can see that that's because she's been infected by the hornets again. Um, and I think there is surprise with the twist, and there are stakes. And there was a really sort of fun little detail I noticed in terms of stakes, where it's kind of like in story. It's about Mike's point of view, and he's saying, "Oh well, I've seen future doctors, so I know that this one can't die." And the doctor corrects him and says, "Oh, actually, no, like, I'm not necessarily safe." And that, I thought that was like a really nice little nod to us as the audience who are listening to past doctors coming back to, be in new stories. It was sort of saying to us, well, you can't. It's not safe. You can't rely on the fact that everything's going to link up in terms of continuity, and all these characters are going to be fine. It was sort of saying, well, they might not be. Um, so yeah, really strong conclusion to the run, and I haven't heard Serpent's Crest, and excited to hear that next.
Well, you can consider Serpent's Crest to be your homework, because I do want to come back in a month or two and do a final episode about that. And Serpent's Crest is my favourite of the three. I really enjoy all three of them, but I think Serpent's Crest does just kind of manage to push through to another level of brilliance. So just before we wrap up, I'm just going to kind of finish on asking you both overall thoughts about this series. How does it compare to Hornet's Nest and that sort of thing? So, Connor, do you want to go first?
Yes, I do think overall it as I've said a couple of times there, it does feel a bit more grounded than Hornet's Nest. It feels a little, maybe a touch more conventional in the sort of Doctor Who stories that it's telling and that it's doing. There's still, as I say, those little touches of Marzi and whimsy. See, I've used that word now as well. Marzi and whimsy, and sort of more offbeat elements. I think out of all of the stories, um, the superhero one does feel the closest to the original Hornet's Nest run. Um, but that's not to knock the others at all. As I say, I really, really enjoyed Shard of Ice. I'd definitely pinpoint that out as my favourite of the run. I think I want to point out, me saying that it's a bit more grounded and maybe a touch more conventional is not in any way a criticism. I think it really, really worked to settle into that more after the um, glorious successes of Hornet's Nest. Um, and it certainly put a little bit more of a focus on the Doctor and Mrs. Wibsey as a TARDIS crew. So that's a big plus. I really, really liked it. Very different from Hornet's Nest, but absolutely on the same level as it. It was a joy to listen to, and I'm looking forward to hearing the third series.
It's it's there's definitely something to look forward to with the third series, because it sort of shifts dynamics again, and it shifts its own format again. The third series is basically, not entirely, but near enough, drops the narration and becomes essentially like a full cast drama, and it's just another take on it. There's a lot more Wibsy as well. Like, she becomes even more companion like, and there's a lot to look forward to there. Mansoor, what are your thoughts overall? Demon's Quest, how does it compare to Hornet's Nest?
I do see the thing about the shift in tone, but I don't think it's not a good or a bad thing for me. It's well, it's welcome to have a bit of variety and try something slightly different. And I think the thing that is important is that there's the tone and the story style shifts a little bit, but the characters, there's a lot of continuity in terms of what's being done with characters like Wibsy and this version of Mike and the Doctor, um, and that feels like really coherent. Like, yeah, it all feels like of a piece, and I'm looking forward to that third series. I know there's a couple of like additional standalone um, CDs as well after that, but I'm a little bit sad that there's not more with this TARDIS crew or this set of characters. Because yeah, I mean you don't want to back and go back to the world too many times, but I would like a little bit more with these characters. So yeah, hopefully there'll be something at some point. Is there anything in prose or like other media with Wibsy or?
So there's, off the top of my head, there's the two other audio dramas with Mrs. Wibsey, which are sort of in the style of Companion Chronicles, that kind of like their audiobook readings. But then there's the Beyond the Doctor series as well, where it's made up
Yes, yeah,
of well, there's a few releases, but Paul did 4 of them. And the sort of finale to that is a Mrs. Wibsey story, and it's like, it's great. It's just so good to hear her again, and it's so good to hear her in a range tied in with other companions as well. Because there's a Polly and Ben story, and a Ian and Barbara story, and a Bessie story, which is just wonderful. Like, we need
yeah,
to do an episode on those
yeah. I've
at
heard the
some
Bessie
point as
one.
well.
That's
They're all exceptional. All 4 of them are just absolutely brilliant stories, and they do make up this lovely little mini series that's certainly a suitable successor to the Nest Cottage stuff that we're looking at now. Well, we'll leave it there for now. But I'm really looking forward to coming back in a month or two and doing Serpent's Crest with you both, because, as I've said, it is by far my favourite of the 3. It's not to sort of criticise these 2 that we've discussed already at all. They're very excellent. They're very good. But Serpent's Crest really does just kind of push it up to the next level. And what we get at the end of it is what is essentially this. It's kind of like if Paul Mars did a Russell T Davies style huge finale. And it's just excellent. It's an amazing way to just sort of round off these 3 series. So I'm really looking forward to getting to that and discussing it with you. But for now, we will leave it there and we will say goodbye. So thank you very, very much for joining me, Connor.
Thank you very much.
And thank you and goodbye to Mansoor.
Thank you.
And we will be back for more Spodcasting very, very soon. In fact, we'll be talking about the 60th anniversary specials, which is very exciting. We'll be back to talk about the Star Beast next week. Goodbye now.